Hey, what's going on, guys? I've got another map for us to look at today. Um, so, if you've tried at all to use the editor since the November update, you've probably realized by now that it's pretty broken. So, we'll be testing our maps in single player games for now. And we'll just load this up here. And the map we're going to be taking a look at is called Enemy Islands. So, let's just launch this game real quick and we'll talk about it. So, at first glance, this may seem a bit like Team Islands, but um, as per the name, Team Islands is a map where all the teams are together on the same island, and this map is quite different. As per the name Enemy Islands, we can take a look at what's going on here. So, we have me, which is the red player, my ally, which is the yellow player, and then we have two enemies on our island, which is the blue player and the teal player. The other allies on our team are the orange player and the purple player, which are diagonal from us. And then we have adjacent to us on the other island the gray player and the green player. So that's basically the concept of this map, is that there are always going to be two islands, and everyone is going to be adjacent to at least one enemy. So I am adjacent to the blue player, who's an enemy. Yellow is adjacent to green, even though they're separated by water. There isn't a player in between these. And then gray and purple will be fighting each other. And then teal and orange are on opposing teams also. Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking to yourselves that there is already a map in the game called Enemy Islands, and you'd be right about that. So if we go into our map, we have a special map which is called Enemy Islands, and we can take a look at what this looks like. But what I'll do is I will reduce the amount of players in the game. So instead of 8 players, I'm going to look at 4 players. So right off the bat, we can see that the fact that this is a special map is we can no longer choose the map size. It's always going to be the same size no matter what. And if we launch this game, we can see that there's going to be a lot of unused area in the map because it's so big. It's always going to be a map that's sized for 8 players, even though we have less than 8 players in the game. So this is where special maps can kind of be a hindrance to us, because we would want our random maps to be more flexible and accommodate different player setups without having this rigidity and inflexibility of having to be the same size all the time. So that's what we are going to be going through today. So when we think about how to make this, we can translate the special map into a random map. We have to think about that the only really complicated thing is how to configure the players, because we should know by now that when we're working with maps using random placement, that it will always place teammates adjacent to each other as opposed to diagonally from each other, which our map is intending to do. And even furthermore, we need to think about how to set zones on the map. So using random placement, there's no way to distinguish between each player's individual zone to be able to distinguish which zones should be connected and which zones should be separated from each other. So with that being said, that should indicate to us that the map would have to be a direct placement so we can have more precise control over which zone is assigned to which player and what position each player is going to be taking. So aside from the player configurations, the rest of the map is going to be pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the map and then copy it into the test script, and I'm going to remove the land generation section. So from there until there. So that's going to be taken out. We're going to put that back in piece by piece. And the rest of the map, the elevations and terrains and objects, are going to be pretty straightforward. Nothing super special about those. So when we're considering what's going to be in the land generation section, we have to consider that when we're doing a direct placement map, we're going to need to independently define the setups for the different player configurations for the number of players in the game. So we're going to need if to player game, else if 3 player game, and then so on, all the way until we get up to 8 players. It'd be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then and if. So what we'll do first is we'll tackle the even player setups first, because those are going to be a bit easier, and then we'll tackle the odd player setups afterward. So right off the bat, when we consider having a 2-player game, we need to think that if we want to have 2 separate islands with opposing players on each island, we won't be able to do that if we only have 1 base per player. So in order to make this work for a 2-player setup, we're going to have 2 bases per player. And we can do that if we know where to put those bases. So in order to figure out the locations to place these lands, we're going to go to our favorite map making utility, which is Madlands. And so right now we have this configured up in a circle-ish pattern. There's a bit of, fluctuation going on, so the locations aren't super predictable. But if we take a look at this, we can control where the player bases are going to be. So if we have our angle increment set to 90 degrees, we can see where those 4 lands are going to be. They'll be pretty equally distributed throughout the map, and in order to assign them to players, let's try to do that. So the first base will assign to player 1, so instead of assigning to @team, we'll assign it to @player 100, and then player 1's other base will be directly opposite of him in the diagonal, so that would be this land here. And then if we consider that the one that's going to be adjacent to player 1 is going to be player 2's base, and then player 2's base, second base, is going to be directly opposite of the first base, which would be these 2 over here. So we have our attributes for these lands already specified. So the terrain type is going to be desert, it's going to take up a certain land percent, and it's going to have an other zone avoidance distance that's dependent on the map size. So if it's a tiny map, the other zone avoidance distance will be 13. If it's a small map, the other zone avoidance distance will be slightly bigger, and so on. So the lands that we create will stay a certain percentage away from the edge of the map, which is specified by these borders here, and it'll have a clumping factor of 20, which will keep the lands nice and roundish rather than being all snake-like. And then the next thing we need to do is to determine what zone to assign. So when we have our other zone avoidance distance specified, it will avoid zones that are not the same zone. So if we want player 1 and 2 to be connected, for example here and here, they can share the same zone. So if I specify zone 1 and zone 1, these players would be allowed to touch, and then the other zone avoidance distance would come into play when separating zones with different IDs. So if I specify zone 2 and zone 2 for these next 2 bases, we would be able to have that other zone avoidance distance. So let's copy this over to our map and we'll see what it looks like. So in the land generation section, we'll copy this into the 2-player setup. And we also must specify the base terrain of the map, which is going to be base terrain DLC water 5. So let's go back into the game and configure it for a 2-player setup. So we will change from the special map to the random map, which is in the test. There you are. Switch it to a 2-player size, and then we'll have 2-player game. And let's see what we get. So, as we can see, this didn't do what we would want it to do. There's only one single island here, with only 2 bases total instead of the 4 that we were intending to have. So let's try and talk about why this is not working the way we would want it to. See, the method that we are using to assign the players is the method that was introduced in UserPatch, which by default does not allow a player to be placed after they have already been placed. Now, there are a couple ways to get around this. So the first method is by setting the flag parameter to 2. So what the flag parameter of 2 does is that it does not remember placing the player that we have assigned. So if we do that for everything, it won't remember it placed player 1, so it will allow player 1 to be placed again over here. So if we go and restart, we can see that we have successfully been able to generate 2 islands and 2 bases per player, with the bases being opposite from each other, red and red, and then yellow and yellow here. And then the second method is by using a method that predates UserPatch. So if we instead go from assign to assign to player, then we can get rid of this @player argument. And then we don't need any of these other parameters also. It's just a generic assign to that player, and it will allow the player bases to be placed more than once. And if we restart this, we should be seeing approximately the exact same thing. Yeah. So we can see the results of what we've done is that all of the islands will stay a certain percentage away from the edge of the map because of the borders that we specified, and that lands that were created that had the same zone ID will be able to touch each other, whereas the lands that had a different zone will be separated by the water, which gives us the map that we have now with 2 player bases per island and 2 enemies on each island. So at this point, we have only specified a single configuration for the locations of the player lands, which means if we were to generate this map multiple times, the yellow player would have his base here and here every single time we generate, and the red player would have his base here and here every single time we generate. And if we wanted to add some randomness into this, we can do that using MadLands as well. So first we would need to adapt our code here, add that flag parameter in to those lands up here, and then these ones down here for good measure. And if we want to add some randomness back in, we can go into the Land Randomizer tab. We can look at, instead of a single configuration, we can look at 12 configurations, which are each 30 degrees apart from each other. Include 4 total lands, include the random statement, that's fine. And we'll generate this, and then instead of being limited to a single configuration, we can randomly choose from these 12. So what I'll do is I'll take this big if branch, and I'll replace this single configuration with that big chunk. And then for the random structure, I will take this and I will just paste it over here up at the top so it can apply to all the player setups instead of just the 2-player. So let's take a quick look at this orientation of the islands, and we will restart this game after we've pasted that randomness back in, and we may be able to see a bit of a different configuration. So we can see that the islands are oriented differently, And that's kind of the beauty of being a random map as opposed to a special map. We can have that randomness in the map that we desire. So at this point, we have taken care of the 2-player setup for this map. And next we're going to be moving on to the 4-player setup, which was going to be relatively easy because it's going to look pretty much identical to what we've done here. There's going to be 4-player bases, and the teams are going to be opposite to each other and adjacent to their enemies. So we'll have some only slight modifications here. So instead of @player, we're going to go for @team. And I do want it to remember which member of the team it placed, so I'm going to reset this flag parameter to 0. And then this is going to be team 2, and then similarly over here. So we are intending that the 4-player configuration is going to be played on a 4-player size map. So we're going to relax the land percent a little bit. So instead of having a land percent of 100, we'll reduce that to, let's say, 13. So, which is, there's going to be 4 total lands that have that land percent. So it would be 4 times 13, which would be approximately 52% of the overall area, which is going to be covered in our land. So let's do the same thing that we did. So clear this, and let's generate 12 configurations again. And we can take this over here, and we will paste it into the 4-player setup section. Let's get out of here, and we will configure this for a 4-player game. So they'll be on the same team, and then that should be all good. So we can see we have red and yellow, which are on a team together on opposite islands across from each other, and we have green and blue on the same team on opposite islands, which are diagonal from each other. And we can see a bit of the effects of the reduced land percent, that we have a bit more of an irregular shape for our islands now that we're not trying to cram more players onto a smaller map size. We can afford to have this bit of more variation here. So that would be about good for the 4-player setup. So let's keep moving on. So next we'll be focusing on the 6-player setup, which in this case is going to be a 2 versus 1 situation on each island. So we're going to be looking at 6 total lands. So the first 3 lands are going to be constituting the first island, which is going to be zone 1. And then the next 3 lands are going to be constituting the second island, which is going to be zone 2. And in this case, we have to spread out the lands a bit farther apart. So instead of 90, we'll go with 60. So we'll have evenly spaced 6-player setup. And then we're going to have a 2 versus 1 scenario. So we're going to have the first 2 members of Team 1 are going to be together on the same island. They're going to be facing the first player on Team 2. And then the next player, the first player on the second island, is going to be on Team 1, and he's going to be facing the next 2 members of Team 2. So let's reduce the land percent a bit since we have more lands. So we'll go with 8% land, so that would be 8% times 6 players would be approximately 48% of the total land that's being taken up. And let's randomize these. So we'll clear. And then instead of looking at 4 lands, we'll look at 6. We don't need to include this random structure anymore. So we have code for 6-player setup, and let's take a look at what that looks like. So, configuring for 6-player game, 6 players. So this is going to be a 3v3, and we'll see what this looks like. Okay, so here is me on the warm color team. We have my ally, which is going to be yellow. We are going to be together, and we're going to be facing green, which is the enemy. And then adjacent to him is purple, our other ally, on the warm color team. And then facing him would be the next 2 players on team 2, which are going to be teal and blue, and teal and blue are, of course, allied to each other. So that's the way the 6-player setup is going to work. It's going to be 2 versus 1 situation on each island. And then we can move on to the 8-player setup. So in a similar fashion, we will expand the number of lands. So first 4 are going to be zone 1, second 4 are going to be zone 2. And so this is going to be a 2 versus 2 situation on each island. So first 2 members on team 1 will be together, and then first 2 members of team 2 will all be on the same island. And then we have the next 2 members of team 1 are going to start off on the second island, and then the next 2 members of team 2 are also going to be on the second island. We can reduce the land percent a bit, so we'll go with 6%, which is also going to be 48% of the overall map. Let's randomize these. Look at 8 lands. And now we have our 8-player setup. Configure this for 8 players. So we'll have 8 players. So we'll have the cool color team here, and then we'll just put player 8 on team 1 also. And we should be good here. So, where did we screw up? Oh yes, that's my mistake. So, before I went and set this up, I forgot to reduce the angle increment. So it's still configured for 6 players, so we need to reduce that increment in order to allow room for 8 players to be configured. So we will try that again. Generate this. And this should be much better. Okay, now we're talking. So we have me in purple on the same team against gray and green, and then we have our allies yellow and orange on the island facing off against teal and blue. So that does it for the 8-player setup. And then now we get to move on to the odd player setups, which are going to be a bit trickier. So let's consider a 7-player configuration, and importantly, let's not forget to change the angle increment again. So instead of 45 degrees, we'll go with 360 divided by 7. This is going to be approximately 51 and some change. So we will be considering 7 lands here, and let's just take a snippet of this. So paint. So if we were to divide the islands in such a way that we had 4 players on one island and 3 players on the other. So we would want this situation to be a 2 versus 2 on this island and a 1 versus 2 on this island. So if we were to assign the teams to be team 1 here, team 1 here, team 2 here, team 2 here, then the other member on team 1 would have to be opposite of these guys, which would be team 1 here, and then the other member of team 2 would be opposite of these guys, which would be over here. And that leaves this land here. So what would this land be assigned to? And the answer is, it depends on which team is bigger. If team 1 is bigger, then this would be team 1. If team 2 is bigger, then it would be team 2. So we can try to set up our positions that way. So we'll start out at the first position on the first island and work our way around counterclockwise. So it's going to be team 1, team 1, team 2, team 2 to represent these 4 positions here. And those are all going to be on the first zone, which is zone 1. So this is all correct. And then next we have position 1, team 1 on zone 2. And now we need to add this flexible land. So we can approach it in this way that I'll show first. So if team 1 size 4, then you can assign to team number 1. Otherwise, we can assign to team 2. And if. And then, of course, we have the last land, which is always going to be team 2. So we have our assignments here, and we can put these lands into the land randomizer, just like we've been doing, and we can get some different configurations. So we'll generate that. And then we'll paste it into the 7-player setup in our map. And we'll test it and see what we get. All right, so let's see what we have here. So we said we wanted a 2v2 on one island, which is red and yellow on a team against blue and gray. And then opposite of us here is the other ally here, the purple player, in a 2v1 situation against green and teal. So that's what we wanted to have happen, so that's working out well. And we can try a slightly different way of approaching the 5-player setup. So we'll configure this for 5 players by having an increment of 72, considering 5 lands. So we will take a snippet of this again. So let's consider that in a 5-player setup, we want it to have the islands configured in such a way that there is a 1v1 on one island and a 2v1 situation on the other island. So if this was team number 1, team number 2, then opposite of this is 1, opposite of number 2 is also 2, and then the flexible land here is either going to be team 1 or 2, depending on which one is bigger. So instead of starting over here on the first position on the first island, we're actually going to start over here, which is what we can call the last position on the second island, and move also in a counterclockwise direction. And we'll see why. So we can call this half zone 2, this half zone 1. So first assignment will be on zone 2, and it'll be assigned to team 2. Zone 2, team 2. And then the next land we have is now on zone 1. It is team 1. So that's correct. And then next we have this land here, which is also on zone 1, and it's assigned to team 2. Zone 1, team 2. And then now we're back on zone 2 again, which is going to be team 1. So zone 2, and then team 1. Now at this point, it's important to notice that we have placed 2 members of team 2 and 2 members of team 1, which means there's only one player left over. So if we just do the generic assignment of at team -10, what -10 does is it assigns to a random player. And since there's only one player left at this point, it's always going to assign it to the correct player regardless of what team he happens to be on. So we can do that, and we can change our land percent a bit. So we'll have 10% overall land for approximately 50% total area. And we'll look at 5 lands to put into the land randomizer. And this should be working out for us for a 5-player setup. So we'll configure it for 5 players on a 4-player size map. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so we said we wanted a 1v1 situation on one island, which is what we have going on here. And we wanted a 2 versus 1 situation going on the other island. So we have these two on a team versus the green player, which is an enemy. So we have done that as we had intended. So that's good. So thus far, we have been working with setups that are pretty standard. What I mean by that is every player is starting with the same starting conditions. So now that we're going to be addressing our final player configuration, which is a 3-player setup, we're going to be a bit more adventurous and allow different starting conditions for the players. So we can try a couple things. So if we're assuming that this is a 2 versus 1 situation, let's try and give the player who's not on a team 2 town centers, while the players who are on a team can have only 1 town center. So if there are going to be 4 total town centers in the game, we can have an increment of 90 degrees. So right now we're looking at 4 total lands, and what I want to do at first is I want to assign the players who are going to be on a team together first, and then the remaining player who's going to be having 2 bases for himself are going to be afterward. So I want to look at 4 total lands. So right off the bat, I'm going to assign to team 1 and team 1, and then whichever player is left over, the one who's not on a team, will be assigned -10. So with respect to the position, the first player on team 1 and the second player on team 1 are going to be on different islands, so having different zone IDs is correct. But I want the teammates to be spawning opposite from each other. So if we consider that the first member on team 1 is going to be spawning here, then the second member has to be over here, which is 180 degrees apart instead of 90 degrees. So I'll just override this and say plus 180. So that would, of course, put team 1 on this position and this position, and then on the remaining 2 positions has to be the player who's left over at team -10. And so it's going to be for this position, it's going to be -90, because that would take this land -90 degrees, would put it here. And then for the final position, it's going to be this position plus 180 to have it be directly opposite. And then importantly, in order to allow the remaining player to have 2 bases, we have to reassign the flag parameter to be 2. And we'll just do it here also for good measure, and then increase the land percent a bit to 13. So let's just take a look at this one configuration. We won't bother randomizing it. We'll just see what that looks like. Into a 3-player game. And we'll see what this does. So as we can see from this, since I am the red player, who has no teammate, I'm going to have 2 town centers, whereas the people who are on the team are each going to have 1 town center each. So this makes it for a bit of an interesting dynamic. Normally when you have a 2 versus 1 situation, it's normally the player who has no teammate that's going to be at the disadvantage. And now we're able to give that player quite a bit of an extra advantage by giving him an extra base to start with. But in this situation, maybe that's a bit too much of an overcompensation. We would prefer to try a different way to try and balance this kind of configuration. So let's try something else. So instead of 4 total lands, we'll go with a total of 3 for 3 players, and I have to reset this a bit so everything's properly offset by the increment. So we have 3 total lands, so we'll just get rid of this one. So this is fine. We can have the people on a team occupying different islands, and then the person who's on his own is going to be sharing an island with one of his enemies. We'll increase this land percent to be a bit higher. It's like 50 divided. So we'll give it 16% land. Let's see what this looks like at first. So right now we have the red player who has no teammate facing off against the yellow player, an enemy, who is on the same island. And then off on a separate island is the lone player, purple, who is on the team with yellow. And let's say that we wanted to give this purple player a bit of a handicap and make him start without a town center. Let's see what we can try and do to try and give this player a handicap. So this player is going to be starting off on zone 2. So if we look at zone 2, we can change these lands independently. So if I change this terrain from desert to dirt 2, let's take a look at what that does. We're able to have a different starting terrain for this player's island. Now, of course, pretty much all we've done is get rid of the wood on his island, which is not really what we were trying to do. So we would need to go into our terrain generation section to achieve what we're trying to achieve here. So let's go to the terrain generation section. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create desert terrain on top of dirt 2. It's going to take up all of the area except the area around the player's town center. So after that next step, we have what we see here. And now the next step is going to be to create some other terrain. This is going to be terrain 39. Going to create that terrain on top of the dirt 2, and instead of set and avoid player start areas, we're going to have a spacing to other terrain types attribute of 3. So after that step is done, let's see what that looks like. That creates that little road terrain there. And now we can cover up the remaining bits of Dirt 2 with desert terrain. And in this case, we no longer have to avoid the player start areas. So now, all that we've done basically is we now have a different terrain underneath this player space than we have underneath the other player bases. And what we can do with that is we can go into the objects generation section, and instead of creating a town center, we'll create a watch tower. And notably, we're going to have a terrain to place on attribute of that road terrain that we specified. And now, if we add a min distance route placement attribute to this, what this is going to do is it's going to prevent the town center from being placed in that same position. So if we restart this game, we can see that instead of this player starting with the town center, he's now starting with the tower, and he's going to have to build a lumber camp to gather the wood to build a town center. So this is the handicap that we tried to give to make the 2 versus 1 a bit more balanced. So I usually don't advocate for uneven starts such as this, but from a scripting perspective, it's actually quite interesting to see how we can achieve things like this. So that's gonna about do it for everything I wanted to cover in this video. And if we need to take some key things away, basically it's how we can use the direct placement setups and player assignments to create very flexible maps. It may seem a bit complicated at first to try and handle multiple configurations with multiple player quantities, but if you have a tool such as Madlands, where you can help visualize the configurations and help randomize the configurations after you've created them, it makes the process a bit smoother. So that's going to be it for me for now. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope you've learned something.